I'm going to moderate today's panel around deep tech in healthcare. My name is Emil. I'm the CEO of a very deep tech healthcare startup called BIOS that tries to develop precision medicines with your nerve signals in the same way that Illumina helps you develop medicines with your genome. And the whole point of deep tech in healthcare is that it's the deepest technologies that can make the biggest difference. But actually, it's very, very hard to build that and take it into such a high-risk, high-trust environment like healthcare. So to give you one story that really, I think, sets the scene is, if you asked yourself right now, what is the most widely used medicine in the world and where did it come from? You may or may not know the answer, but it was actually a lab in Glasgow. So in the 1960s, at the same time we were trying to land on the moon, a guy was working in a lab in Glasgow trying to figure out how to combat heart failure and high blood pressure. And at the time, experimenting with chemistry and then moving from his research lab into a company called Imperial Chemical Industries, he invented the beta blocker. And at the time, his vision was that everyone could really cheaply and easily take a tablet and deal with this huge cause of death. So 50 years later, this is now really commonplace practice around the world. It's medicine that we don't even think about. But what these guys are all doing is thinking about medicine that we haven't thought about yet. And that journey going from something that's just a kind of a vision in the eye of a deep tech entrepreneur to something that we can trust and use at scale in healthcare is one of the most important journeys, I think, happening in deep tech. So hopefully this is a chance for each of the members here who are either entrepreneurs, technologists or investors in this industry. I'm hoping for them to do two things. One, to share their vision of what could happen that we haven't thought of yet, but also kind of explain the complex, imperfect act of making it real. So without further ado, I'll ask each of the panelists just to give a short introduction to themselves and what they do. I'll start here with Ronan, if Ronan wants to go first.
Yeah, hi, I'm Director of AI Research at IESO Digital Health. It's a psychotherapy company that delivers online mental health one-to-one between patient and therapist. I joined them 5 years ago and saw it grow from a company of 30 to near 200. Prior to that, my background is in natural language processing, machine learning, and so it's my job to try and find the insights in the data that we've collected to improve mental health.
Perfect. Louise.
Yeah, so great to be here. My name is Luis. I'm CEO of iLoF. iLoF is a health tech, deep tech company that basically works with pharmas and biotechs to help them cut the time and the cost that it takes them to develop therapeutics, especially personalized therapeutics. So my background is in engineering. I was actually trained as a computer scientist. And yeah, we operate in the intersection between biology, data science, and physics. And we're currently working with, pharmas and biotechs in the UK and a little bit around Europe and the States.
Perfect. Neciah?
Hi, everyone. I'm the CEO and one of the founders of FluoretiQ. We're a Bristol-based medtech startup. And before I tell you what we do, I'll say why it's important. So antibiotics are a pillar of modern medicine. On average, they add about 20 years to our lifespan. We're about to lose them to misuse. So FluoretiQ's mission really is to enable clinicians to have the right data to deliver the first prescription as the right prescription. So no more of this, go home and come back if it doesn't work.
Perfect. And Mike?
It's hard to follow that, isn't it? I'm going to start with a fun fact, because that's what we were told to do. So the fun fact I didn't reveal is I used to be in a band in the late 80s. So that's a fun fact. And I'm going to spoil Lewis now, because Lewis used to be a tango dancer. So there we go. You got two for the price of one. At Bloc, we're a deep tech investor. We tend to invest in the underlying layers that sit below everything else that you guys do. Whether it's processing or it's connecting things together or it's securing or it's analysing. So we're the guys hidden even deeper in quite a lot of what you do. So we're kind of often powering the things that you're doing within your application fields.
Perfect. So I wanted to really ask people on the panel to share that vision that they're seeing deep inside their company that could be changing the world for health. So quite a broad question, which is, how would you, for each of you, and I'll start probably with Ronan and go across, but how do you define deep tech, if that's the category you believe to be in by being on this panel? And what do you envision to be sort of the key theme in terms of deep tech impacting health for the next sort of 5 years?
Yeah, so I guess my definition of deep tech is very broad in the sense that it's about it's a set of techniques and tools that are used to recommend, predict, elicit insights from data in an automated way. And that applied to healthcare. Obviously, healthcare is a very sensitive domain, and there are lots of challenges around how you transform something that's in the lab and some vision you see to put it into real people's lives. But in the next 3 to 5 years, I think we're going to see much more applications of human in the loop or human assisted AI. So, especially in the areas of image recognition and natural language processing, which are get quite a lot of media coverage over the last number of years with the advances in deep learning and so forth in those domains. And we have some examples of that in some companies that use image recognition as a second sort of, or as an extra input to medical professionals' diagnosis of a condition.
Can you give us an example of something you're seeing or something you think you might see soon in that kind of workflow?
In the domain that I'm working in, and in healthcare, we're starting to use, in IESO, we're starting to use signals extracted from the data, providing them to clinicians to help them with their diagnosis. Some of the challenges over the next year are the kind of regulatory frameworks around this, and how basically, technology moves faster than the regulatory space, and it's very much incumbent upon us in society to kind of move those frameworks forward.
So it's basically how to regulate a therapist using AI data to improve their care delivery.
Any sort of insight or indicator, whether this patient might have a suggested diagnosis or a suggested treatment plan and so forth, and how that fits into the regulatory sphere, whether it's what sort of medical device it may be, what sort of data you need to provide to the regulator to indicate that it's safe.
And for you, how to control that team that develops the technology in the background.
Exactly, because software is much different than these physical devices that we've had throughout in classical medicine, and that regulatory framework is kind of evolving, shall we say?
Perfect, Louis, how do you see it?
Yeah, so I would go with what just mentioned. So there's a concept that really strikes me, which is what would you do, and what could we achieve as a community if suddenly we had access to the global data all in one place without silos and without restrictions. And I think a lot of what you're going to be seeing in deep tech in the next few years will hopefully be the result of a lot of silos being torn down and a lot of more interoperability between the data. And that's just going to unlock a lot of use cases, especially around the usage of AI in healthcare. Right?
So again, the same question, maybe 10 years from now or 5 years from now, what's a use case you can imagine that we can't?
Well, I think personalized medicine, as many use cases around AI, it's all about the data, the quality of the data, right? So I'm a computer scientist by training, and it's usually garbage in, garbage out, right? So it's really important to have very good data. So I can very much see AI assisted diagnosis becoming a reality in primary care. So not AI diagnosis per se, but just cutting the time that the physician needs to go through all the data and use.
So I'm chatting to my GP, and the GP is getting a secret recommendation. It's probably
on
hypertension
on a screen, or maybe on an augmented reality kind of smart glasses that the physician is using, and for the patient will be transparent. The idea is that the patient. So the diagnosis is always made, and we work with physicians all the time, and this is, I think, a key thing that we learn. Diagnosis is made by a physician per definition. Yeah. Machine will not, at least until we achieve singularity or something like that, I don't really see a diagnosis being made by a machine, but it will be AI enabled, and it will really cut hopefully some of the barriers that currently exist around access to healthcare globally.
Neciah, how do you see things?
Just to pick up on what Luis was saying, actually, he mentioned something about the quality of the data. And for me, part of deep tech is really creating paradigm shifts in what we're able to do today by increasing the fidelity of the information that we could get through improved data collection. So for in our case, we're on the diagnostics end, so improving the accuracy and speed at which we get information about the patient's condition, and then the ability to sort of aggregate that information on a global scale is the second layer of that. And in terms of where I see things going, it's really around, and I'm going to be biased there because of my field, but it's really around pandemic preparedness. So right now we do have an ongoing pandemic of antimicrobial resistance, but because data is collected on the order of 2 to 3 days right now, it's hard to pinpoint where it starts, where it ends. And even for the patient, it's hard to get your first treatment to be successful, particularly if you're vulnerable. And so I see the real benefits of deep tech and rethinking the way that we actually approach these problems with the tools available to us today as a real paradigm shift in patient outcomes, but also in 3 to 5 years from now, that perhaps we don't have to be at the point where we're having to shut down the entire world because we got the treatment right the first time.
Right. Do you think people appreciate the scale of the potential problem around antimicrobial resistance? And do you think people see, the potential benefits they could have, or do you think that's what people need to realize?
I think it's hard to appreciate now because antibiotics in particular is so easily available in one sense. In some countries, you don't even need a prescription. You could just go up to the counter and grab them. We don't realize how important they are until perhaps we have a sibling or a loved one who has cystic fibrosis or who's undergoing chemotherapy, and the doctor is saying, okay, well, this drug has stopped working, this one has stopped working, we only have one left. And sadly, there are people who've died because they've run out of options for antibiotics. And the other thing is just knowing the scale of the problem. Not many people are aware that just a year before COVID, antimicrobial resistance related deaths was 1.2 million people. 1 year later, COVID was 1.9. And we have probably close to 2,000 COVID therapies in the pipeline right now. We have less than 100 new antibiotics.
Wow.
The last new one was invented 30 years ago. So we're at a really critical point now where we have to be really smart about the use of antibiotics. And new drugs is not the way out. Actually, new drugs was not the problem in the first place. It's how we use them. If we get smarter using them and giving clinicians the tools that they need to make the right decision when a patient is in front of them and requiring some attention, requiring some therapy, just giving them that guidance to say, okay, yes, they do need antibiotics and this is the one they
I think to echo the opening story, the beta blocker, the biggest medicine in the world, invented in Scotland 50 years ago, 75% of people who are given them at the moment, they're being dosed incorrectly. So that sort of inefficiency of use is a clear theme. Yeah. Mike, I'm curious if you have a wider definition of deep tech here or a wider vision for it in healthcare.
I've been thinking about that. As engineers and scientists, we like to sell what we know, and so we push onto the market what we think. So I've got a couple of points I wanted to make. So I think deep tech is the fundamental science and engineering that sits below the waterline, the things you can't see. It's not apps layer stuff. It's everything that actually is probably doing the real work below, somewhere below. And it could be in the hardware layer, it could be in the semiconductor, it could be the semiconductors that are sitting inside, compute instances in the cloud, and then some magic software that sits on top of that, and then all the application layer stuff that presents what happens to people like you and I. I was going to go back to a comment. So in the eye of the pandemic, one of my portfolio companies was in the, was digital appointments and setting up digital appointments for face-to-face consultations, and then transcripting the consultations, and then allowing you to do some very elementary ML to look at patterns of what's happening. And what I was actually going to share with the room was more how not to do it story. So this company was extremely successful at signing up, various different entities that are facing off against patients, GP surgeries, super GP surgeries, and then kind of a broader group of people that, kind of cluster all these things together. But the story that I took away from that one was everything was lined up. This is almost like the perfect storm. I mean, terrible, because we talk about the death rate, we talk about the impact it has on people's lives. But here was an opportunity to inject technology into an industry that's fundamentally rejecting technology, doesn't want to do anything other than the old way of doing it. And the team failed to execute. So yes, they signed up the surgeries. Yes, they got millions of patients onto a platform. But actually, the magic that should have come after that never happened because the team didn't execute. So the only thing I would say as an investor, with such a founder-led and panel is execute, please, because there's no point having a vision, having the technology, and then not actually doing the work of getting your stuff to work for everyday humans.
So when you say execute, you mean the technology wasn't functional, or do you think?
No, technology worked, right? The sales and onboarding people worked.
So what was the execution gap?
The gap was really the customer. There's two customers. There's the immediate customer, which is the GP surgery. They weren't ready to extend their service out in this manner. So yes, they signed up. But they didn't extend it out in a way that made it easy for consumers to go, I know what to do. So there was the whole, when you break execution down, sales execution down, it's not just your immediate sale and getting something in. It's how do you onboard, how do you make people aware, and things like that. And so that was a very specific example of where I think we as investors and early stage founders, we should always bear in mind, how do we get this thing into people's hands in a way that's meaningful and easy to use. But in terms of roadmap and futures, I've always believed that when we instrument the human, you can then push back onto the humans and decision making. And I've invested in two companies that actually were deep tech companies that instrumented the human, one in critical care and the other one in everyday monitoring of the ECG heartbeat patterns. With instrumenting the human, you can improve your understanding as an individual about what's going on in your body. And then the other roadmap item that I think there's a constant tussle between bits and pills. The tendency of the industry is to push more pills into you rather than think about how do you use digital to inform, whether it's your mental health, as you were talking about, Ronan, or it's avoiding the misuse of prescriptions for your particular area, your therapy areas. But I'm not a therapy area person, but my observation are instrument the human better, inform the human more, and actually from that comes better decision making at an individual level, and then across cohorts, and then within jurisdictions.
So your vision really is about sort of really embracing the true digitizations that are happening in terms of the explosion of data and this incremental ability to reduce the need for molecules that are not always going to be the
solution. Look, people want to crush compounds and sell you a pill, and we know that the level of prescriptions, particularly in the UK, is phenomenal. The amount of people taking drugs in this country.
So I think that's
blows
really
me
good.
Away. But I think that we have to somehow understand the human body better, and everybody's body responds to things in a different way.
So I think this is the opening gap. I'm going to treat you as the challenge, right, for the other three on the operator side. So because the reality is that getting it, you mentioned that didn't execute, which is that after you do all the hard deep tech things, you then have to do the last mile scrum that any other business would have to do. If the doctor doesn't know how to sell it, help them. And and that healthcare is one of the most complex and aggressive environments for that. You've got different types of patients, you've got different types of time and needs and attention, you've got the payers who are going to pay for certain things and not others, and there's structures that you're never going to change about that industry in the near term. You've got investors who want to see that something is coming from this vision that they've invested in, and the trust required as well for clinicians who are fundamentally going into work every day knowing that they're responsible for the person they're talking to trust what you're giving them and to understand it, right? And to use and value the new approach you're giving them. So the last mile scrum is the hard part. And there are many tailwinds and headwinds, I think, that we all can see in our industry. And I wanted to give you guys maybe a minute or two each to sort of respond to how you guys, dealing with the tailwinds and the headwinds around this really complex, getting it into the real world challenge. And I maybe want to start with Neciah.
Okay, thanks. I think probably some of the tailwinds we're seeing now, particularly in our space of diagnostics, is the awareness. So most of us would have had to perform a diagnostic test on ourselves over the last 3 years, and we get an appreciation for the importance of that information to going about our lives, and that's great because That drives, interest from innovators. It also drives interest from investors. So we've seen new people enter the space who probably were not considering it before. In terms of the headwinds, there are several. Regulations are changing, and there's also the general awareness, and as you pointed out, of the payer's needs and the clinician's needs and the patient needs. There's so many stakeholders involved there, and there needs to be a good balance. And I think for us, one of the things that I can say that has been beneficial over the last few years is having R&D driven by our interactions with actual stakeholders. Mm-hmm. So our choice of first application was actually dictated by conversations we had with clinicians. Our business model is considering the fact that, the industry might like disruptive technology, but they don't like disruption because it's bad for a very risk-averse sector, and the stakes are extremely high. And so it's rightly so, we need to consider how we fit. We can't just come in and say, I'm going to flog a new piece of kit. It's not going to work. We need to consider, okay, what exactly am I going to do? What service am I providing to the patient that could slot into existing practice? And so what that means in terms of us as a headwind is that there's a longer lead time, because that takes time to define a new care pathway, to define it and validate it with the stakeholders that we're engaging with.
Louis, you're at the other end of the spectrum on the drug development side, right? So what do you see as the challenge there to get that last mile scrum?
So first of all, I actually want to add one thing on what you're just saying. I think people don't realize how much of a change it was to have diagnoses made at home, not by a physician, through an antibody test that we bought in a pharmacy, and then based on that we would spend 2 weeks locked in our rooms hoping that everything would be okay. And that is, it just, with patients and with physicians, it just changed a lot in regards to how people accept innovation in healthcare. And so we're working together with the head of pathology of a large public hospital in Europe, and one of the things that he mentioned is that he sees patients asking, okay, is there any way I can do this at home? Is there any way I can do this remotely? Do I really need to go to the hospital? That's something that completely changed, and I don't think I don't think we're going back to the way it was before. I think people will look for more and more technology in their lives in what it regards.
And so it's sort of created kind of use cases people can accept now that they couldn't accept before.
It's normal. They've seen it work. It worked at scale. It saved them time. It saved them effort. There's no going back. And that's very positive, because people want, in a way, innovation. They don't want disruption. And they're afraid of new things, especially in healthcare. So go fast and break things doesn't work in healthcare. Yeah. It just doesn't. So that was a very, very positive thing, and that's a trend. I would say distributed, in a way, aids to diagnose. That's a trend that's certainly going to stay.
So it sounds like for you, these. If you're betting on a deep technology, then it's helpful if the market's already giving you new ways to sell it, rather than to try to solve that risk at the same time. Yeah. That's the best way to think about it. Yeah. Makes sense.
Now, on the other hand, there are regulations it's a mess. I'm on a lot of health tech founder groups, and I can share that there's a lot of companies, thinking about skipping the entire European healthcare market completely until the regulation, it's more clear what are, let's say, the shortest route to regulatory approval, and a lot of people just focusing their chips on the US market, because it's difficult, but at least we know the recipe. We do 1 + 1 is going to equal 2, and in Europe it's complicated, especially.
And the FDA has actually started to become easier to deal with.
The sandbox has helped. We took two companies. So I took two companies through the sandbox process, and one of them is about a science monitoring company, and then it was deployed in Mount Sinai and a bunch of other, literally overnight. And so that sandbox process is something that, Europe, I do love Europe, I really do. And I have a place in Portugal, so I have to declare openly, I really do love it that much. I bought a place. But we have to look at some good practice generally in terms of how do you expedite the processes without putting people at risk, I think. Because the FDA have got a sandbox process, it does actually work and actually adds value to the product development process. Europe's just a cluster of stuff and treacle, I think.
So Ronan, you run a team that has to be trusted at scale, dealing with mental health and AI technology in the nasty mess of also, European markets. So how do you deal with that as an operator?
Yeah, so actually I just wanted to hark back to just add one kind of extra headwind with regard to this that I don't think was mentioned. I agree completely with the regulatory mess at the moment. But also there's kind of societal understanding of AI, and I think it was mentioned in the last panel, the explainability of AI, what people are willing to accept. AI is not going to get everything right. It's going to make mistakes. Are people willing to accept certain mistakes, and what mitigations have we got around those mistakes? Often human physicians make mistakes, and there's certain different processes we have kind of evolved over the time to hold those to account and to improve our processes. That's different for AI, and how to communicate that to the public as well, the patient, such that it's more accepting, going back to the point that was made earlier, to involve all our stakeholders. So I think that's a big headwind. It's science communication as well as kind of the regulatory path. And kind of some of the tailwinds, there's actually, I'm a little bit optimistic with regard to some of the tailwinds that are pushing us along with regard to kind of, first of all, before kind of the recent financial turmoil, the investment that's been coming into the domain has been useful. The maturity of the AI at this point in time, not a day goes by when a new large language model or image diffusion or image generation system comes about. So there's a lot of maturity in the AI space, and paradoxically, the pandemic has shifted the mindset of a lot of people. So we've had examples there of, self-diagnosis, but also it's changed how we communicate. Before the pandemic, 80% of psychotherapy, one-to-one psychotherapy on the NHS was conducted face-to-face. And we, as a company, we had a platform which allowed people to talk, and we were trying to get people to show them the benefits of this, that it improves access. People in the Highlands of Scotland don't have to travel a long way to see a therapist. You can see a therapist out of hours, so reduce the stigma of having to tell your boss potentially about that you're having therapy, etc., etc., etc. But that's just, we didn't have to make those points after the pandemic. Everyone just moved overnight to accepting, I can get therapy one-to-one. It's the obvious way to do it without having to go to a bricks and mortar building to talk to my therapist. So I think there's a lot of tailwinds there that have paradoxically came out of a really, really bad situation.
I just want to check with the organizers. Do we have 1 more minute, or how are we at the time?
Yeah, 1 minute.
Okay, so I think, maybe I'll try to summarize what we've covered here, because actually there's a depth of knowledge in deep tech, which means that every single one of you, including the investors in the space, can see thousands of things and have solved, countless issues and problems to bring this future forwards. But what I hear from everything everyone said here is that the power of deeper technologies, particularly ones that capitalize on that explosion of data, this huge demand that's only increasing for better health, needing to do it more efficiently, especially as we go into the economy that we're all globally driving into now. There is an inevitability of what these people are making being needed and beneficial at scale. But the big uncertainties are sort of threefold. Over what time frame? Is it going to be 5 years or 20 years? And that's a life or death situation for anyone who could benefit, and for the businesses and for the investors. In what business model is this going to be accessible? If the technologies on the background are there, will Louis find the right avenue because of what's happened, or actually will it have closed the avenue that he needed commercially? And finally, sort of ethically, what are we going to do about these technologies? So everyone here has, by virtue of their experience, the know-how around that technology. And one of the hardest challenges, as they explained to the audience, I think, was to try and clarify what's right and wrong at the same time. And you can imagine, my grandmother was dealing with high blood pressure, and she was being treated during the pandemic, and she couldn't understand every complex decision her clinicians were making for her. And then when she had to be treated remotely, the team that was also supporting her had to explain to her why it was okay the doctor was sort of calling in. So if you think about the trust in healthcare, how do you keep that as you start to move fast but not break things? So the timing, the business model, and the ethics around this potentially inevitable huge industry seems to be the big kind of source of value creation. So thank you for sharing your examples, guys, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to chat post the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.